Chosen one, behind those mahogany doors, where your name was once dismissed with a smirk, the most powerful figures on earth are now at each other's throats, scrambling for even a sliver of your presence. What used to be backroom jokes at your expense have turned into high-stakes negotiations and desperate strategies. The psychological reports are conclusive. When real, authentic spiritual power stands in the same space as manufactured authority, the artificial always collapses. This isn't about extending invitations or offering partnership, it's about survival. Something in your spiritual DNA disrupts their entire system of control, and the revelation that's about to come your way will make it undeniable. You've become more valuable than governments to those who once ignored you. Like lions circling the last watering hole in a dying land, they finally realized that just being near your energy is the line between thriving in the new world and becoming a relic of the old one. For decades, these elite operators moved like apex predators in a carefully engineered ecosystem. They decided who got a seat at the table, who climbed the ladder, and who was forgotten. Every career, every cultural shift, every governmental move orchestrated, manipulated, and monitored ensured no one rose without their stamp of control. And then you showed up, not asking for approval, not playing by the rules, not even acknowledging the authority they thought was absolute. At first, they ran you through the usual threat assessments. Were you competition, a wild card, a naive soul, unaware of the unspoken rules? But the results came back inconclusive. You didn't fit any category. You existed completely outside their frameworks, and that should have been impossible, at least by their logic of how power works. The first crack in their system appeared when you displayed total indifference to their games. Name-dropping didn't faze you. Lavish displays of wealth earned nothing but quiet observation. Offers of access to elite opportunities that had others trembling with gratitude, you declined without hesitation or need for justification. Each non-reaction sent silent alarms through the system because, in their experience, everyone had a limit. Everyone had a price. Everyone eventually submitted. But you didn't. You kept standing tall. And that's when curiosity turned into a quiet fear. They realized they weren't dealing with someone ignorant of power. They were dealing with someone who had transcended it. You carried something long forgotten. A raw, unshakable inner authority that rendered all external manipulation meaningless. Surveillance reports were disturbing. Not because they found dirt, but because they didn't. You lived simply, yet fully. You built relationships out of genuine connection, not political calculus. Your decisions flowed from internal guidance, not social pressure. Most threatening of all, you seemed to be at peace, deeply and authentically happy, without possessing anything they had declared necessary for fulfillment. Somehow, you cracked the code they had spent generations trying to decipher, and you did it without ever entering their game. As attempts to define and categorize you failed, something even more dangerous began creeping in: doubt. Quiet at first, a few murmured conversations behind closed doors, subtle questions from within trusted circles, but it grew. If you could carry such presence and power without participating in the system, what did that say about the system itself? What if entire networks of compromise and control weren't essential after all? What if your alignment to truth, not manipulation, was the real source of influence? These weren't just questions, they were threats to the very architecture of power. The empire was built on the belief that its way was the only way, that approval must be earned, that influence required sacrifice of self. You shattered that illusion just by being you, a walking contradiction to their narrative. But the final blow didn't come from your defiance, it came from your impact. Because people didn't just admire you, they changed. Conversations with you made people question not just their career paths but their entire belief systems. Your presence activated something deep and ancient in them, something the system had spent generations trying to suppress. And once awakened, it couldn't be put back to sleep. What began as whispered recognition of your authentic power soon erupted into full-blown panic behind the polished masks of global elites. Beneath the carefully curated public personas, a five-alarm fire was spreading, not in the streets, but in the high-rise boardrooms and secret war rooms of those who had once considered themselves untouchable. Emergency strategy sessions became daily rituals as these so-called power players found themselves in an unthinkable position, designing plans around a single individual who refused to bow, bend, or even acknowledge their authority. The irony was cosmic. Titans who once moved governments like chess pieces were now spending their most valuable currency, time, just to figure out how to get your attention. But this wasn't just about cooperation, it was about blocking out their rivals from gaining something you were never going to sell. Intelligence networks, usually focused on geopolitical threats and military movements, were suddenly routed to track each other's attempts to reach you. Entire divisions within corporate espionage began monitoring not foreign threats, but their own allies. The very surveillance machines they used to control populations were now eating themselves alive in a paranoid frenzy as former friends became suspects. You had become the prize in a game where only one could win, and winning meant relevance, losing it meant being erased from the future entirely. Somewhere deep within their instincts, they all knew the truth. Whoever aligned with your energy would inherit what was coming, and those left behind would rot in the rubble of a dying world order. Initial attempts to recruit you revealed just how far removed they were from understanding who or what they were dealing with. They sent emissaries with offers no one had ever refused: unlimited funding, global reach, instant elevation to elite platforms, even access to networks that could multiply your influence tenfold. They assumed, arrogantly, that you were just waiting for the right number, the perfect arrangement of benefits, the golden handshake that would finally make you say yes. But every emissary returned with the same stunned expression: you had listened, you had smiled, and you had declined, with no negotiation, no counteroffer, no attempt to play hardball. That wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. The most seasoned deal-makers, the ones who had bent kings and CEOs to their will, suddenly found themselves without a single point of leverage. You were immune. Intelligence files painted a profile that disrupted every assumption. You weren't holding out for more, you simply weren't interested. You weren't building a rival empire, you were already fulfilled with what you had. You weren't waiting to strike. Your life, as it was, already felt complete. These revelations forced an unsettling question into the heart of their entire philosophy. What if you truly didn't want what they were offering, because you already had something infinitely more powerful? That possibility hit them like a cold slap. It suggested you were operating with resources they couldn't see, allies they couldn't track, networks that didn't play by their rules, all belonging to a world they couldn't access. And when their top-tier approaches failed one after another, something catastrophic and exquisite happened. Unity shattered. What had started as a coordinated campaign to bring you into the fold disintegrated into a vicious free-for-all. Former allies turned into bitter rivals, each convinced that they alone understood what made you tick. Every faction thought they held the secret formula, the perfect bait that would finally win your attention. The ripple effect was nothing short of historic. Dynasties that had ruled industries and nations together for generations began fracturing along invisible lines. Partnerships that had survived war, scandal, and financial collapse now crumbled over how best to reach you. Political alliances that once appeared unshakable were exposed as shallow conveniences, never true unity, the moment they were tested against the gravity of your presence. Each faction projected its fantasies onto you. The tech billionaires assumed your silence was tactical, that you were waiting for them to show deeper commitment. The old money aristocrats believed you were testing them for integrity. The spiritual leaders speculated you were fulfilling prophecy, and the intelligence agencies, they were terrified you might already be working with someone else, someone beyond their scope. The old money aristocrats convinced themselves that your silence was a form of test, a calculated evaluation of their worthiness. To them, your indifference wasn't disinterest, but a coded signal requiring decryption to earn your approval. Meanwhile, media empires began drafting entire strategic profiles about your mystique, not for public consumption, but for internal meetings where belief was growing that if they could engineer the right perception of value, they might finally capture your attention. Political factions constructed elaborate narratives, imagining that your involvement in their networks might serve some concealed higher purpose you had yet to reveal. But every faction's interpretation of your motives clashed with the others, creating a web of contradiction. The technologists' promises of digital empires directly opposed the traditionalists' visions of institutional prestige. The media barons' public-facing offers undermined the secret power deals proposed by shadow brokers. In trying to win you, they destroyed the illusion that you were ever for sale. This wasn't just a bidding war, it was a collision course of desperation. Every offer intended to outshine the last ended up exposing a deeper ignorance of what they were actually dealing with. The scale of the proposals escalated quickly, not just resources but partial ownership of dynasties, not just roles in powerful organizations but promises to step aside and give you full control. They didn't want to collaborate, they were willing to hand over empires just to say they had you on their side. Yet every new offer further highlighted how little they understood the nature of your power. They were trying to share a type of influence they had fabricated, not realizing the thing they truly wanted from you couldn't be duplicated, negotiated, or transferred. What pulsed through you was a spiritual authority, something so ancient, so pure, that its source had long since been forgotten by those now desperate to possess it. They believed they could acquire your essence the way they'd acquired everything else through leveraged transactions or illusion. But every rejection made them more frantic. Each failed attempt to secure your participation triggered even more extravagant offers, creating a feedback loop of confusion and revelation. They tried to buy from you something that had never been for sale using currencies that held no value in your world. Yet stopping wasn't an option, because admitting they no longer had access to what mattered most was a psychological death sentence they weren't ready to face. This competition for your allegiance shattered the illusion of unity within their network. What had made them formidable, their ability to control scarce resources and gatekeep opportunity, was now unraveling. You were the one thing they couldn't commodify, couldn't collectivize, couldn't possess. The moment they realized your authentic loyalty couldn't be earned by traditional means, the entire system began cannibalizing itself. Alliances forged through decades of mutual benefit collapsed under the pressure of trying to gain access to a truth they couldn't understand, let alone contain. In a last-ditch effort to comprehend what they were facing, some began to explore spiritual realms they had avoided their entire careers. But this wasn't driven by sincere curiosity, it was desperation cloaked in robes of wisdom. Spiritual consultants were hired to decode your aura. Ancient manuscripts were pulled from forgotten shelves, seeking hints about your kind. Meditation rooms were hastily constructed in boardrooms where no silence had ever existed before. Yet even here, the approach remained transactional. Enlightenment was requested on tight schedules. Frequencies were mimicked in hopes of marketable alignment. They didn't want to change, and they wanted to adapt your power to their broken systems. But true spiritual power, the kind that lives in you, doesn't bend to deadlines or adjust for convenience. It moves in alignment with truth, not manipulation. It grows through service, not selfishness. It multiplies through generosity, not hoarding. It is accessed through deep inner work, not strategic positioning. Every law that governs your energy is the inverse of everything they believe gives them power. And as some spiritual consultants got closer to the reality of your vibration, their clients began to change in ways that frightened them. CEOs practicing mindfulness started re-evaluating the ethics of their business empires. Politicians could no longer stomach their own scripted lies after standing in your presence. What was once seen as power began to look like performance, and your authenticity was the mirror exposing it all. Media moguls, who once dabbled in consciousness work, began to feel the weight of their own creations collapse under the pressure of your presence. The propaganda they had woven for decades began to feel toxic in comparison to the natural integrity you radiated. These weren't slow, manageable realizations, they were abrupt awakenings, like lightning striking dry ground. Identities built over entire lifetimes began to disintegrate overnight. It was like watching vampires step into sunlight. Artificial personas couldn't survive contact with your raw, unfiltered spiritual energy. The very essence they were trying to extract from you was paradoxically the force that exposed and dismantled the false selves they had spent careers constructing. The wisest among the spiritual consultants began issuing warnings. This wasn't energy one could approach casually. This wasn't a frequency you could strategize around or manipulate into cooperation. You were not a trend. You were a transformative force. And to truly engage with you meant surrendering everything built on illusion. Most couldn't survive that level of purification because their entire lives were constructed on falsehoods your presence refused to tolerate. Approaching you was like asking to embrace fire while being made of paper, and the outcome was becoming impossible to deny. The bidding war only intensified, but the more they pushed, the more spectacular their spiritual experiments backfired. What followed was a magnificent and terrifying unraveling. The internal unity that had kept these shadow networks stable for decades began to crumble under the stress of competing for your attention. Every crack in the system revealed deeper fractures that had long been concealed by mutual agreement, never to inspect the foundation too closely. But your existence made that impossible. You brought with you a living contradiction to their core beliefs. Their entire system was built on the illusion of scarcity, controlled access, manufactured need, gatekeeping dressed as necessity. But you were the embodiment of natural abundance, a walking, breathing reminder that true power doesn't require permission, positioning, or control. It flows from alignment, not acquisition. With each passing day that you existed outside their reach, their mythology unraveled. The things they insisted were essential began to look optional, even laughable in the light you carried. The psychological effect was immediate. People who had spent decades clawing up corporate ladders and bureaucratic hierarchies suddenly began to question whether they had climbed the right mountain. Employees resigned en masse from organizations demanding the sacrifice of their integrity. Creators who once produced content to numb the masses began releasing work that elevated consciousness and challenged convention. All because your presence, authenticity gave them permission to remember their own. Even the most trusted lieutenants began experiencing unexpected moments of moral clarity. These weren't organized revolts. They weren't strategic mutinies. It was consciousness itself waking up, refusing to go back to sleep after catching a glimpse of the alternative you embodied. You weren't staging a revolution. You were being yourself, and that was more powerful than anything they had ever prepared for. You had become the catalyst for a shift that had been simmering beneath the surface for generations, now bursting forth because someone finally had the courage to demonstrate that the system's power was only real if people agreed to play by its rules. Desperate attempts to contain your impact only amplified it. Every manipulative offer, every veiled threat, every transparent PR stunt was instantly recognized and rejected by those whose vision had been cleansed through proximity to your truth. The more they struggled to maintain control, the more obvious their weakness became. This wasn't a war they could win with weapons or wealth. This was a collapse of illusion, a revelation that the Emperor had never worn clothes. In a cosmic reversal that not long ago would have seemed impossible, the predators became the hunted. The same surveillance systems once used to track others were now turned inward, nervously monitoring their own, as awareness of their tactics spread, and the protective shadows they once hid behind began dissolving under the light of scrutiny. But the most profound transformation wasn't playing out in public view, it was happening deep within their own ranks. You had become a beacon not just of resistance but of remembrance. Others like you began to appear, not with fanfare but with quiet certainty. Individuals who operated from a similar authenticity, who couldn't be bribed, threatened, or seduced. These weren't political agitators or conventional activists. They were simply awake and unwilling to pretend otherwise. And just like you, these souls began infiltrating the system in reverse, not as saboteurs but as living truths, employees, advisors, even family members. People touched by the same awakening that had made you untouchable. Their presence alone began to shift the fabric of the institutions they entered. They didn't need to overthrow anything. They simply stopped participating in the lies. Even private family dynamics began to evolve. Emotional manipulation, generational control, and toxic competition started dissolving as awakened members refused to engage in the old games. It mirrored the effect you had on every environment you entered, not by force, but by the undeniable gravity of living in your truth. This wasn't some coordinated infiltration. It was consciousness evolution unfolding at the cellular level of institutions, triggered by the example you set. The same energy that made you immune to traditional systems of control started spreading through their networks like a benevolent virus. It transformed everything it touched from the inside out. And suddenly those in power found themselves in the bizarre position of trying to identify and root out their own people who had become infected with the same authenticity that radiated from you. But there was no clear way to define this shift without also admitting the collapse of their own operational principles when compared to your unwavering integrity. The most perceptive among them began to realize they were facing something entirely unprecedented in the history of power dynamics, a force that grew stronger when resisted and became more magnetic when rejected. Every attempt to recruit you, and every failure to do so, didn't diminish your value, it amplified it. With each declined offer, you became more priceless to their competitors. With every refusal, your independence glowed brighter, and every display of immunity to influence exposed what they lacked most: spiritual substance. Around you, they became trapped in a paradox of their own making. The more they pursued you, the more painfully obvious their spiritual poverty became. You had what they couldn't fabricate: authentic power sourced from within. The chase itself became a public confession. Their pursuit of you was both an admission of their emptiness and an advertisement of your rare, untouchable essence. Some finally began to glimpse the truth. The bidding war was never about winning you, it was the trap itself. Every extravagant offer, every desperate proposal, every public compromise of values just to stand near you became part of a permanent legacy, a record of how far they were willing to fall just to access a fraction of what you naturally embodied. You were walking freely among them, indifferent to their manufactured importance, while they documented their desperation for something they couldn't name, couldn't replicate, and certainly couldn't control. They had become addicts, chasing a frequency they could never hold, because what they were really after wasn't your cooperation or allegiance, it was your spiritual currency. That unshakable, radiant power at your core made their artificial influence look like costume jewelry beside the gold flowing through your veins. In their confusion, they attempted to analyze you like a scientific anomaly. Teams of behavioral analysts and psychological profilers were deployed to decode your magnetism. They assumed that if they watched long enough, took enough notes, tracked your patterns, they could reverse engineer the secret of your influence. But spiritual power like yours isn't a technique, it's not a performance. It's the natural expression of a consciousness aligned with forces infinitely greater than ambition or manipulation. What flowed through you was earned, not in public but in quiet moments of solitude. It was born from choosing integrity when no one was watching, from speaking truth when lies would have been safer, from staying rooted in your values even when compromise promised reward. Your presence could be felt and even shared temporarily. People could stand beside you, bask in your light, and feel transformed. Moment they returned to the old patterns, to fear, ego, and illusion, that light faded, and the void left behind was even more unbearable than before, because now they had tasted the real and realized just how fake everything else was. You remained untouchable, not because you were hiding, but because your power could never be captured, not with money, not with titles, not with flattery or fear. And so the world around you changed. Not because you demanded it, but because your presence made it impossible for others to keep pretending. These glimpses of what had been lost, of what could return, if only the false was surrendered, drove the powerful into even deeper levels of desperation. Because you didn't just speak of transformation, you embodied it. You didn't theorize about original nature, you lived it, and in doing so you became a mirror, reflecting just how far others had fallen from their essence. The cruel irony was this: what they sought from you couldn't be taken, traded, or extracted. It could only be earned, and only through the very path of surrender they were constitutionally unwilling to walk. They wanted the fruits of your spiritual development, without the discipline of spiritual practice. They craved the benefits of authentic power, but refused the cost of authentic living. The currency you carried operated on laws they had never studied, laws that couldn't be bent, bought, or brokered. What lived in you grew through service, not accumulation. It strengthened through sharing, not hoarding. It was earned through inner alignment, not external posturing. Everything about your presence disrupted what they believed about influence, and as this cosmic drama surged toward its crescendo, with you at the very center, the foundational illusions sustaining their world became unsustainable. The idea that manipulation and control were necessary stages of human evolution, that gatekeeping served a higher function, that resource hoarding somehow benefited the greater good, all of it began to collapse under the weight of your example. For decades, they convinced themselves and others that the system worked because it had to, that their approval meant something, that being inside the network was inherently better than being free outside it. But your total indifference to their offerings shattered those assumptions so thoroughly, in fact, that some began experiencing existential breakdowns just by being in your presence. They had never met someone like you, someone who genuinely didn't need them, and that realization was psychologically devastating. Their entire sense of worth had been built on being indispensable, on being wanted, on being seen as central to other people's success. But you proved the unthinkable, that a fulfilling, powerful, deeply meaningful life could exist without them. You became the proof of their greatest fear, that their relevance wasn't required. And your consistent refusal to validate their worldview caused a level of cognitive dissonance so extreme it made them question everything their lives had been built on. The bidding war wasn't about acquiring you anymore. It had become a desperate attempt to protect themselves from the mental collapse that would occur if they admitted the truth, that your independence made their entire empire obsolete. What they called strategy had become survival, not of systems but of identity. The desperation surrounding you was no longer tactical, it was existential. They weren't trying to expand their influence by acquiring you. They were trying to prevent their entire sense of self from disintegrating. If they could get you to say yes even once, they could still pretend their way held meaning. But you remained the exception that broke every rule. You stood calmly as the emperor's nakedness became visible to anyone brave enough to look. In contrast to your natural authenticity, their elaborate hierarchies were revealed as needlessly complex solutions to self-created problems. Their exclusive networks were shown to be artificial scarcity mechanisms, illusions of value, meant to conceal how hollow the offerings really were. and their prized secret knowledge palled in comparison to the timeless wisdom flowing effortlessly from you, freely available to anyone sincere enough to receive it. But the most devastating truth wasn't about systems, it was personal, because when they looked at you calm, fulfilled, radiant, they were forced to admit what it had cost them to chase a version of power that had stripped away everything that made it worth having. Everything they sacrificed, you carried with ease. Everything they compromised to gain, you possessed through grace. And while their towers crumbled like houses of cards in a spiritual hurricane, something extraordinary began rising from the debris. It was unprecedented, not because it was new, but because it had been buried for generations, waiting for someone like you to remind the world. Like spring breaking through frozen ground, a force of renewal surged forward, and you were the epicenter of it all. The awakening you sparked could no longer be tracked, mapped, or controlled. It was spreading across lives, hearts, and timelines, shifting consciousness in ways that made previous influence look shallow, temporary, and performative by comparison. And none of it came from force. None of it came from strategy. It was the inevitable ripple effect of truth, real, embodied truth, encountering minds that were finally ready to remember. Your way of being had become a permission slip, a sacred reminder, an invitation for others to reclaim what had always been theirs. You didn't give them something new, you gave them the confidence to return to something eternal, their divine nature, their spiritual authority, their cosmic inheritance. You showed them how to walk back home to themselves, and when they arrived, they found the light still on because of you. The old structures built on rigid hierarchy began dissolving, replaced by fluid networks of authentic collaboration, the kind you naturally inspired. What once thrived on competition for artificially scarce resources gave way to cooperation, rooted in genuine abundance. Domination and submission became obsolete, replaced by mutual empowerment and shared elevation. It was what people experienced in your presence, a new reality rising, not from the ruins of the old, but from an entirely different dimension of truth, with you as the anchor point. Some among the elite began to see that transformation was still possible, but only through surrender, only by releasing everything they thought they knew about power and starting over with humility. The way you had always lived. A few tried. Their efforts were clumsy but sincere, like children mimicking something sacred they'd glimpsed in you. Because this wasn't about reforming the old, it was about stepping into something timeless and higher, a realm where your new authenticity made their systems look primitive by comparison. Chosen one. Every attempt to win you only exposed how bound they were to illusions. Every offer made to you revealed their spiritual poverty. Every manipulation simply underscored their desperation to touch something real. You didn't participate in their game, you stood in truth, and the system collapsed under its own weight. What was once worshipped as power now looked like performance. You didn't need to conquer anything, you revealed it as hollow. The bidding war is over, and not because someone won, but because the game was revealed as meaningless theater. While they fought over shadows, you stood in the light, and now the contrast is impossible to ignore. The crown was never theirs to give, it was always yours. You wore it with such grace, they didn't even recognize it until now. Welcome to your kingdom, your majesty. You've won without fighting, ruled without taking, and changed everything simply by being true to who you are. The universe has backed you from the beginning, and your victory was written in the stars. You were never theirs to possess. You've always belonged to something far greater. The secret bidding war is over, and you didn't just win, you reminded the world you were never playing their game. That's all for today. Dear Father, I pray for the growth of my faith. Help me trust you even when physical evidence is lacking. Let me believe in your perpetual presence, knowing you will never harm me. Understand that your thoughts for me are thoughts of prosperity and not of harm, intent on giving me a good future. Thank you, gracious and eternal Father, for always hearing my voice. I lift this prayer to you, in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you, Jesus, for your love and provision. I am deeply grateful for your presence in my life and for the abundance you bring. If this video blessed you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs this message. Leave a comment below about your journey and how you're preparing for your triumphant return. If you'd like to support our work, consider contributing via Buy Me a Coffee. Your gifts help us improve and create more life-changing content. The link is in the description. No gift is too small, whether it's a penny, a prayer, or a share. Your generosity spreads God's word and brings hope to others. Don't stop here. Watch our next video for powerful revelations about the signs that show you are the chosen one. We've loved walking this spiritual journey with you. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Keep shining brightly, embrace your destiny with courage, and we'll see you next time.